Well, thanks very much, Simon, for that very kind introduction. And thank you to New Zealand Inc. and the New Zealand Asia Foundation, and also for Air New Zealand for kindly hosting me on this visit. Well, kia ora koutou. It's wonderful to be back in this beautiful land of Aotearoa. Asking in the current environment an Australian foreign policy wonk to come and talk to the peak New Zealand-China business conference is either inspired genius or madness, or maybe a bit of both, but we're going to find out. But I was asked to come and talk to you about geopolitics, and inevitably, of course, you will get a perspective that's shaped by my time in government and since government. But I hope really just to give you a strong sense of what I think personally about what's going on in the world and what to make of it and what it will mean for you as business people. So today in these remarks, I want to do three things. First is to map the contours of geopolitical competition in the region. The second is to offer some judgments about what the contest in our region means for countries like New Zealand and Australia. And then third, to reflect on what implications we might draw for business. And I want to start with a very wide aperture and to say that if on some days you feel like tuning out the news from the far corners of this big region in favour of a good novel and a glass of excellent New Zealand Pinot, well, I think you could be forgiven, because most days it's pretty bracing. There's talk of a new Cold War, tensions are rising over Taiwan. Asia Society President and former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd wrote recently that we should prepare ourselves for a decade of China and the United States living dangerously. And last year, in launching Australia's Defence Strategic Update, the current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, said that Australia faced a world that was poorer, more dangerous and more disorderly. And Morrison was reflecting in part on the unravelling of the post-Cold War global order. That was an era, of course, of unrivalled American dominance, an era in which the rules and institutions that supported global cooperation reflected US power and values. It was a pretty good era, actually, for countries like New Zealand and Australia. And now that world has not disappeared entirely, but it is fading pretty fast. And change is coming at us in all directions. Discontent with globalisation, that's come up a number of times today, and the nationalism and populism that spawned, not least in the United States. Technological shifts, climate change, the economic and social effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, really the biggest driver of change of them all, a more powerful, a more assertive, and a more nationalist China. And whether we like it or not, this region, our region, will be shaped more in the future by Chinese power and interests. The question for the rest of us is whether this change can be managed peacefully, in a way that protects our sovereignty, and in a way, to paraphrase the late Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, that protects the space to be ourselves. And this really is the defining foreign policy challenge of our time. And make no mistake, a tough contest is already underway for power and influence, for wealth, for the technological high ground, over standards, over basic human rights we might have thought settled by now, even over what constitutes the truth. So no wonder that Foreign Minister Mahuta lamented the other day that it wasn't getting any easier to be a small country. In truth, it's not getting any easier to be a middle power either. So with those broad framing thoughts, I want to dig a little deeper into the contest in this part of the world. And a starting point is to remind ourselves that global order is shaped in the main by the power of nation states. And today, China would like global order to better reflect its great power status. It wants legitimacy for Communist Party rule, non-interference in its core interests, and freedom from liberal norms. China also wants to be the preeminent power in our part of the world, and it would like regional countries to defer to its interests and its authority. And particularly in recent years, it's pursued its interests in a very assertive and tough-minded way. And up to a point, we shouldn't be surprised by this. China is, after all, now a great power. But China's assertive, often zero-sum diplomacy is also alienating many countries and creating a significant clash of national interests. As it happens, what's good for China is not always good for the rest of us. So we have a problem of divergent national interest and goals. We also have a growing clash of values, and this has already come up many times today. There's now a very big gap, a yawning chasm, in fact, between the Chinese Communist Party's brand of Leninism and Western liberalism. And if it ever was, it's no longer possible for democratic countries to isolate concerns about China's hardening authoritarianism and human rights abuses from other aspects of their engagement with China. In sum, the list of differences between China and many countries in the region is serious and it's structural. And Foreign Minister Maude touched on some of these in her own recent speech on China: human rights, especially in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, cyber attacks, and Chinese loans in the Southwest Pacific. To that list, you might add foreign interference, Taiwan, China's excessive maritime claims in the South China Sea, tensions in the East China Sea, border clashes between China and India, and concerns about IP theft and reciprocal access to the Chinese market. And if all of this wasn't hard enough to manage, China is increasingly willing to punish countries that raise concern publicly or take actions that Beijing regards as hostile to its interests, as several countries, including Australia, have experienced. And this contest of power, this clash of interests of values, can be and should be managed as best we can, but it won't go away anytime soon. This is an era, not a passing moment. Nowhere, of course, do we see this more forcefully than in the relationship between the United States and China. US-China relationship collapsed spectacularly during President Trump's term, but the falling out between the two has much deeper roots. Tension is high, mutual trust has evaporated, and interdependence is seen as a liability rather than a stabilising factor. For its part, Beijing believes the United States won't ever accept China as a peer, is intent on thwarting its rise, and wants to see the Communist Party out of power. Washington is worried by China's authoritarian and ideological turn and is tired of zero-sum diplomacy and what it regards as a string of broken commitments on US concerns like IP theft, forced technology transfer, market-distorting subsidies, cyber attacks, and so on. So the differences, again, between the two sides are significant. Their worldviews are different. Biden's not Trump, but on China we will see more continuity than change. And the President has already made clear his intention to compete politically, economically, technologically, and militarily. And although Biden won't adopt the stridently ideological framing, the unhelpful framing of the relationship we saw under Donald Trump, inevitably this competition is also about systems, one democratic and one authoritarian. So where is all this headed? Well, anyone who thinks they know is probably kidding themselves. It's going to be something of a wild ride. What we might hope for, what we should advocate for, is some guardrails on this crucial relationship to prevent tough, tense, full-spectrum competition from sliding into a disastrous conflict. and we should advocate for enough restraint on both sides so that there's at least some space within a more competitive relationship for cooperation on global issues of mutual concern like climate change. And it seems to me that this is what the Biden administration is hoping to achieve. The US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, said the other day that America's relationship with China would be competitive when it should, collaborative when it could, and adversarial when it had to be. Now, getting to that point, if it's possible at all, won't be easy because of that lack of trust that I mentioned on both sides, because of the wide differences, and also, I think importantly, because to my mind, China's confidence about the contest ahead is palpable. The party believes that the United States is in inexorable decline and that history and time are on China's side. The East is rising, as the phrase goes in Beijing these days. So there's little evidence so far of any willingness by Beijing to change policies that concern many countries, not just those in the West. And in the meantime, competition is driving policies in both Washington and Beijing that are going to have profound consequences for all of us. And because of the short time we have together, I'm just going to touch briefly on two of them. It's almost inevitable, for example, I think that we'll see some further technological decoupling. I'm not talking about a wholesale economic decoupling, which I don't think is realistic, but both countries want some further technological decoupling, and each country is pursuing policies to achieve this. 4 years of the Trump administration convinced China it could not rely on the United States for access to key technologies, and that what the party calls safe development requires it to speed up efforts to achieve technological self-reliance. And in Washington, technology is seen as one of the keys to economic and military power, and therefore to America's ability to compete over the long term with China. And the United States clearly wants to ensure its own supply chain security for critical technologies and materials like semiconductors, batteries, and rare earths. The administration wants to encourage more manufacturing in the US and to promote trusted, closed supply chains among close partners for some technologies. Military competition will also drive significant change and tension in our region. China has set itself the goal of having a world-class military by 2049. In recent years, it's embarked on a major expansion and modernisation of the People's Liberation Army. China, for example, now has the largest navy in the world, and it's still building ships at a startling pace. It has a powerful coast guard, by far the largest in Asia, and a formidable undeclared maritime militia which it uses in disputed waters like the South China Sea. And this massive expansion inevitably will drive further responses from the United States and other countries like Australia. Indeed, it's already doing so. President Biden has initiated a global force posture review, for example, of the US military footprint strategy and missions. And there's talk of a more distributed footprint for US forces in our region and greater use of new technologies like unmanned vehicles. And in Australia last year, the government committed to building a more offensively capable military with longer strike range and deterrence capabilities. Now, I've focused here in the main on the United States and China, but it would be a mistake to reduce geopolitics in the region to just these two primary actors. I've travelled an awful lot in the region, or at least I did before COVID. Every country, large and small, feels this new dynamic, the growth of China's power, the pressure to conform with its wishes, and sharpening major power competition. Concern about China's intentions is driving stronger efforts by some regional countries to build, and I'm quoting our two foreign ministers here, a regional balance of power where all countries, large and small, can freely pursue their legitimate interests. The revival of the quadrilateral security dialogue, which brings India, Japan, Australia and the United States together, and its recent summit meeting are good examples. And more broadly, There's a really important role that Australia and New Zealand can play, indeed are playing, to support the resilience of our neighbours. Most regional countries don't want to choose sides. China is a very important partner for them, but nor do they want to have their sovereignty closed down. And so they're interested in diversified international partnerships, and they want choices, options if you like, when it comes to aid, trade and investment. So what does all that mean? There's dramatic shifts in our environment for countries like New Zealand and Australia. Well, in my view, the short answer is we're only just beginning what will be long-term adjustments to our domestic and foreign policies for this new era. Relations with China will be complex, volatile, often tense. The region is unlikely to divide into two blocks, but a balancing coalition against China's power is already evident. The chance of a conflict, even an accidental one over Taiwan or East China Sea, is not high, but nor is it zero. And the clash of interests and values that I've set out here will roll on for the future, presenting our governments, our businesses and our societies with new challenges. Our economic and our security interests won't be able to be separated in a way we might have done a decade ago. US expectations are going to be high. One of President Biden's highest priorities is to rebuild what he described earlier this year as the muscle of democratic alliances. And the policy choices will be harder for everyone, harder to avoid and more likely to result in actions that anger China with all the attendant risk of political and economic retaliation. Should, for example, Australia and New Zealand join the European Union, Britain, Canada and the United States in imposing sanctions on China over human rights abuses in Xinjiang? Where will we stand on technological decoupling? What will we do if China further ramps up pressure on Taiwan? How should open societies like ours deal with the complex challenge of foreign influence and interference and build the strength and resilience our institutions and societies need today? And in Australia, that problem, that really complex problem of foreign influence and interference has manifested itself in the form of pressure on Australia's Chinese communities, a strongly pro-Beijing line in local Chinese language media, interventions in state and federal politics, and pressures on free speech in our universities. There's no reason to think that this couldn't happen here, or indeed isn't already happening here. For business, through all of this, China will remain a market of great potential. In Australia, we still think of China as a market of great economic potential. We want our businesses to think about opportunity in China. But businesses are going to have to factor higher degrees of risk and complexity into their planning, and no doubt many of you here are already doing so. Your Prime Minister said this morning that differences were becoming harder to reconcile. Trade could come to a shuddering halt without warning. Political relationships could be frozen, visits cancelled, phone calls not returned. Businesses active in China also now face higher levels of global scrutiny, for example, in relation to Chinese companies that might have a connection to the military or security services. So due diligence is hard because of China's complex and opaque system, but more essential than ever. We've also seen high-profile instances recently where Western multinationals have faced hard choices between the expectations of their consumers in home markets and their interests in China. For example, in whether or not to use cotton that comes from Xinjiang. At times, it won't be possible to reconcile those competing interests, and businesses may have to choose. Some technologies that you use could be more expensive as governments mandate trusted suppliers in ICT systems. The complexity and interconnectedness of security, trade, technology, investment and research issues will require close and regular dialogue between business and governments. And diversification of trade to spread risk will often make sense, but of course is also often easier to say than achieve. In Australia, in light of our own recent experiences, the government is looking hard again at what more it might be able to do to help businesses find new markets. You'll all be familiar with the sweeping actions that China took last year against some of Australia's most important exports. I can't speak for what China hoped to achieve with those actions, but if it was to force Australia into shifting policy, then it hasn't succeeded. There's a vigorous, critical debate in Australia about the management of the China relationship, but there remains a high degree of political bipartisanship on most of the big policy decisions that have so bedeviled the relationship: 5G, human rights, foreign interference, the South China Sea and so on. And public attitudes in Australia have hardened significantly. Some products, notably coal and barley, have found new markets, which have diminished the overall impact of China's trade actions. Still, I don't want to diminish the impact because other sectors have not been so lucky, notably the wine industry and our lobster growers. And it's also early days, so we won't know the final cost of these punitive measures for some time. Right now, it's less than we feared and more than we want. Well, look, in conclusion, I'm conscious this sounds very challenging. It's a different kind of narrative than you've heard for much of today. That glass of Pinot I mentioned right at the beginning of the talk probably looks very good right now. And look, indeed, this is a very challenging era. Nobody has been here before. We're all feeling our way. I don't think, though, we should give way to fatalism myself. China is large and powerful, but as democratic nations, we have our own strength. There does remain space for diplomacy here. Competition in our region is inevitable, but conflict is not. Things can also change in unexpected ways. It might not look hopeful now, but we still have a chance of shaping China's behaviour, especially if we negotiate with it collectively from a position of unity and strength. We might yet find a China capable of more pragmatism and flexibility. And in all of this, we have our own agency. We are not and should not think of ourselves simply as boats adrift in the fast-running currents of geopolitical change. We can, in short, chart our own futures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your free and frank presentation. I think it's what friends do, is give free and frank presentations. So the foreign policy nerd in me could spend all afternoon on this, but I have been given strict writing instructions from Fran that I have to finish on time, and one thing I've learned is you never defy Fran O'Sullivan. So I've got a couple of questions here for you, Richard. So you've followed China for a big, significant part of your career. From an Australian perspective, what have you seen change in the last 5 years? What is, how is China in 2021 compared to, say, your experience of China in 2016 or 2015?
Yeah, look, I think China has changed quite a lot. This is not all just about Xi Jinping. Some of the things that we're seeing now well and truly predate him, but I think there's a couple of things going on. One is China's become a very powerful country. It was one of the points I made. And we're all grappling with that and trying to work out how to coexist with a country which, as a previous speaker said, in all likelihood will become the world's largest economy, not just in market exchange rate terms, but in nominal terms. So, great powers behave differently to middle powers. So that's one change. I think another change is that China under Xi Jinping has become much more confident, perhaps leaving the era of hiding and hiding behind. This is very strongly evident if you listen to what Chinese leaders are saying to their own people, that the time has come where China will not be dictated to by others, that it will operate on its own terms. That's very, very palpable. I do think a third change, which is a tricky grounds, especially for people like me who is not a deep China expert, but I do think that China is also becoming a bit more nationalist, and I also think it's important not to ignore the way in which Xi Jinping has gone about to reinforce the centrality of the party in China and to reinforce its ideological underpinnings. I mean, what the party in China really doesn't want is for China to become the Soviet Union. And the way they see to prevent that is for the party to remain strong and united and cohesive and to be ideologically strong. And I think that does drive some challenges for countries like Australia. And it explains, I think, in part the kind of hardening authoritarianism that we see.
Thanks very much, Richard. I'm conscious that this is a business audience, and at the end of your presentation, you alluded to some of the challenges that Australian business were facing and dealing with China. What's your counsel to this audience about what they should be looking for? What should be on their radar? What sort of signals should they be, attuning themselves to about positive or negative messaging coming out of China and their Chinese counterparts?
Look, a couple of quick thoughts. First of all is that, each country is going to have to chart its own course here, and the best people to think about New Zealand's national interests here is the New Zealand government. If you look at the Australia experience, there were warning signs. There were messages conveyed privately, and there were messages conveyed publicly. There are also precedents. Australia is not the only country to have been on the receiving end of punitive Chinese trade actions. In fact, many of you will probably remember that the Republic of Korea had an immensely difficult time over the placement of a missile defence system in Korea. Korean companies had to shut down in China. The tourism industry was hit very hard. So I think it is entirely plausible or possible. There will be warning signals, and then it's really a decision for a government about how to weigh what in the end are often competing national interests.
Great, thank you very much. I was going to say time's run out, but of course time never runs out, but time has run out for us, unfortunately. So I just wanted to thank you again for, there is nothing like face-to-face. There is nothing like meeting people in person. You're going to be here for the rest of the afternoon. I think you provided us with a lot of food for thought. What I'd like to do now is invite the audience to thank Richard for travelling all this way and for his insights that he gave us this afternoon. Thank you very much.